Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin the first plenary session titled Changing Security Architecture in Asia. This session will be moderated by the Ambassador for Cultural Cooperation of the Republic of Korea, Son Ji-ae. Ambassador Son, the floor is yours.
Sorry. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting us for the open plenary session. And the discussion topic, the changing security architecture in Asia, is a fundamental issue that will determine the future of Asia. My name is Son Ji-ae, as introduced, the Ambassador for Cultural Cooperation, which is in the category of soft power. But today we will be talking we'll be dealing in the realm of hard power. Just to set the stage, we all know that Asia is poised to move. The traditional architecture of the bilateral alliances, the formation of the hub and spoke, with the U.S. being the hub that provided the stability in Asia that has allowed Asia to grow and prosper for decades, is changing. In many ways, many would say is no more. And other economic blocks are rising. Security and economic blocks are starting to form. The continued competition between the US and China, and in our backyard, the continued tension surrounding Taiwan, the South China Seas, and of course North Korea, as well as the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, are impacting our region in a way that is both deep and long-lasting. And as countries in this area struggle to position themselves in this ever-changing and volatile security climate, hard questions are being asked about what the future of the Asia security structure will look like. And so on this panel, as you can see to my left, we have a vast array of experts who will, with their collective wisdom and thoughts, shed light on what the future of the Asia security system will look like. And so without me continuing to talk about what could be happening, I will turn the mic over to them. Let's start with Professor Michael Green on my left. A lot of you who follow Asia's security climate will be very familiar with Professor Green, but set the stage for us in terms of how you see the Asia security climate changing and what the challenges that we face.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Son. I thought I might focus my very brief first remarks on the aspect of the architecture that received so much attention in the video and in Kurt Campbell's speech, and that is the growing and intensifying security collaboration among plurilateral, minilateral groupings of U.S. allies, the Quad, AUKUS, the Camp David Summit, the U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral. Now we have the Squad with the U.S., Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. It's remarkable, and it's clearly at the very center of the Biden administration's strategy for this region. And we could talk about this more, but I think it will also be at the center of a Trump administration strategy, to the extent there is one, towards the region. It's quite striking for me. In the late 90s, I worked in the Pentagon for Kurt Campbell. My job was putting together these minilateral groupings. The first U.S., Korea, Japan defense trilat I worked on, the beginning in 2001 of the U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral security dialogue. In those days, these were niche efforts. It wasn't what the cool kids did. It was kind of like being in the math club or the chess club. And now it is the root and trunk of not only Japan's strategy, but clearly the U.S., Australia, India, Philippines, and now Korea as well. And I think it's quite enduring. The U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy from the White House mentioned allies and partners 33 times. 10 years ago, in polling, the American public was asked, is the future of Asia guaranteed best by cooperating with China or by cooperating with our allies and partners? And 10 years ago, the American public was split pretty evenly. Today, overwhelmingly, 85, 90% of Americans say work with allies and partners. In Korea and Japan, the U.S. alliance enjoys over 90% support. In Australia, where I work, our center did a survey. 75% of Australians want a security treaty with Japan, India, Korea, Australia. There's a dynamic to this and a bipartisan consensus in almost all these countries that makes it quite enduring. What I think we need to think about a little bit is, where does it go? You know, are we heading towards an Asian NATO? I don't think so. There are some limiting factors. Economic interdependence in Asia is very different from the story during the Cold War in NATO. Intra-regional trade within Asia is at 60% of all trade. It's up. It's up even in an era of de-risking, decoupling, and supply chain security. I think the U.S. has a particular obligation to answer the question, how does this competition end? All of the U.S. allies, in one way or another, have predicated this unilateralism and competition with China on getting to a more productive relationship with China. The U.S. message is very unclear. Some say we win when the CCP collapses. Others have other views. I think that's one limiting factor and incumbent on the U.S. to address. In the same way, the trade architecture in the region begs for American leadership, as I'm sure Matt Goodman and others will discuss. The other thing we have to navigate is values, democratic values. I personally think Joe Biden is right, and Karen House was right, that we are in a competition between authoritarian and democratic visions of the future of international order. The problem is it's not that simple, of course. In surveys we did when I was at CSIS, outside of China and Singapore, the vast majority of thought leaders in the Indo-Pacific, from India to Japan to Korea to Thailand, the vast majority thought that democracy, good governance, women's empowerment, human rights were the right priorities. People say these countries don't want to choose, but when it comes to democratic values, they have chosen. But the same survey also showed that in India, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in what we might call the global south, there was strong support for the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. This, what you might call post-colonial sense, that development challenges for these countries are things that the US, Australia, even Japan don't fully understand. So we have to navigate that. I don't think we abandon our democratic values. I think that's key, but we, as we work these multilaterals with Korea, with Japan, have to focus on what we deliver in terms of resilience, development, and good support for good governance and democracy. And then the last complicating factor we'll have to negotiate is, at some level, although the foreign ministries are too polite to say so, at some level, these multilateral groupings, whether it's the Squad or the Quad or AUKUS or the TSG with Japan, Australia, at some level, these are meant to deliver deterrence effects, to dissuade and deter. The problem is these are not mutual security treaties. They're anchored on mutual security treaties, but the Quad is not a security treaty. AUKUS is not a mutual security treaty. The US, Japan, Korea, Australia trilateral process is not a mutual security treaty. And that creates some mechanical difficulties in how you develop planning, operations, training that we'll have to negotiate. But the bottom line is these multilateral architectures are here to stay. They're not going to go away. How much they move towards an Asian NATO, to me, depends more than anything on the choices Xi Jinping makes. All of these multilaterals developed largely after some move by Beijing that upset and worried the partners involved. So that's going to be a key vote. But the other key vote on the future of these multilaterals is going to be US allies. And I'll end with this. But the US is now in an era of dependence on allies in this region like we have never seen before. And so allies get a vote. So if allies think the US strategy has got to answer the question, how does competition end? I think to have a successful strategy, the US is going to have to think about the answer to that. If allies want the mechanics of the alliances to work in terms of defense production, intelligence sharing, Washington's going to have to answer that. And ultimately, I think this is stabilizing. This is not a bipolar region, as Asan's video said. It's multipolar. And I think ultimately multipolarity puts into the mix countries that are going to reinforce and emphasize stability. So I'm generally optimistic, but we have some navigating to do.
Well, you emphasized China's role in this, but the other side of it that I think many people are wondering is the U.S. side, and not just on a general side, but what about a Trump 2.0? How does that affect the architecture? We will go into detail, but just to follow up on what you've just said.
Well, we may have different views on the panel. I think that that the personal views of Donald Trump are disruptive and negative for alliances. But the views of the majority, the vast majority of Congress, and polls show the overwhelming of the majority of the American people, and the institutions of government and business, their support for alliances has never been stronger. So I think, look, many of these minilaterals that I'm talking about began during the Trump administration. And I think the people who go into a Trump 2, if it happens, will have a very wide variety of views, but there will be plenty of people who want to continue that effort. So might be chaotic, but I don't see what I'm describing as ending.
So Professor Green has sort of laid out the U.S. side, but he's also tossed it over to you, Professor Jiang Guo, because the other factor in this changing dynamic is China, he pointed out. How do you see the changing dynamic from your perspective and Asia's future?
Well, thank you. I think I share a lot of things with Mike on the changes in this part of the world. You know, comparing to what the situation is like 10 or 15 years ago, I think the Asian security architecture has deteriorated tremendously. At that time, we had some kind of a US-centered, US-led mosaic of agreements or security arrangements. You have the bilateral alliances, you have the minilateral arrangements, and then you have the multilateral cooperation. And also, at that time, China was part of it, even though at the margin. And there were efforts on the part of the US to get China involved, and China also made efforts to work together with other countries to deal with various kinds of challenges the region was facing, such as the Korean nuclear problem and the war against terror, and this and other issues. So the situation was a much better situation. Now, it's still US-centered, it's still US-led, but not accepted by the Chinese, and probably most likely Russia, and maybe some other countries in private, not in public. And at the same time, it's much more confrontational. And the multilateral arrangement has never been weaker, such as East Asia Summit. And we are not working together on the hotspots. We are trying to outcompete each other in a way. So this is a situation far worse than what it used to be. And of course, I think both sides, especially China and the US, try to imagine the worst coming out of the other country. And of course, the US is the stronger party, so it imposes a lot of its imaginations about China and adopt efforts to deter the alleged threat from China. And then China had to fight back against the alleged evil intent on the part of the US. So we see a process of negative interactions. If we look at the future, it doesn't bode well. If the US is successful, China would be made the enemy of the US. Okay. I don't know that's a good situation for the U.S. or not. Personally, I think it's not a good situation for the U.S. to create an enemy many times larger than North Korea. And of course, this is not good for China. We don't want to have an adversarial relationship with the U.S. So it's time for us to think about the situation very carefully. It's time to sort out, what kind of interests we have. If you look at the interests objectively, I think we have a lot of shared interests and stakes at the moment. Okay, but we imagine things, and we let our domestic politics to prevail, and that's not going to work. I think it's time for us to take a pause and then develop policies on the basis of our interests rather than our imaginations. Thank you.
So just to follow up on you say, do you see ways that Beijing is moving towards a less adversarial and confrontational positioning in Asia?
Of course, China has been taking quite a number of measures, but they are often interpreted from a negative perspective.
The imagination aspect comes in.
Right, right. We're reaching out to the U.S. and trying to stabilize our relationship. We don't want to fight a war over Taiwan. We don't want to fight a war over, some rocks in the South China Sea. We want to make sure that we don't have an accident that may lead us there. And we want more economic relations, and we want, for example, the more collaboration on development of high tech, but our efforts have not met with reciprocal measures from the Biden administration so far, other than to building a guardrail to make sure that we don't fight a war over accidents.
Yeah. We've heard from the U.S. perspective and China's perspective, but this kind of competition does impact other players in the region, and not the least of all, Korea. Professor Kim, from your perspective, how do you see the future of the Asia Security Alliance, and how does it impact Korea?
Okay, thank you very much for Asan Institute for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to distinguished experts. As you may agree, security architecture evolves in response to changing security environment in the region. By the way, a recent trend is that it is a shifting from ASEAN-centered or ASEAN Plus to minilateral groupings such as America, Japan, Korea, CJK, China, Japan, and Korea, Quad, AUKUS, etc., etc. This means that existing ASEAN-centered, kind of ASEAN-based multilateral institutions are still relevant, but not quite central to the regional security architecture. One of the major reasons for this recent development is U.S.-China strategic competition, as Ambassador Son has just laid out. As a result, ASEAN is somewhat divided, and this has, had some adverse impact upon ASEAN centrality. Nevertheless, ASEAN-centric institutions have served as main platform for discussion of regional issues. However, in the past few years, newly initiated or created unilateral groupings or arrangements had a serious impact on the regional security architecture and economic system. as seen in the case of many groupings. But Southeast Asia, as you may agree, is the region where the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and China's BRI are overlapping. So in that sense, Southeast Asia is critically important from the perspectives of the United States as well as PRC. In this vein, the emergence of unilateral groupings is partly reaction to the limitations of the existing institutions to cope with the variety of regional issues. So these unilateral kind of arrangements are taking on increasingly substantive role as they are more narrowly focused. Among others, US, Japan, Korea security cooperation mechanism is the most recent unilateral, and it is expected that this trilateral should strengthen its deterrent capability vis-a-vis North Korea, but also contribute to regional peace and prosperity. US-Japan ROK should also seek a constructive and stable relationship with PRC, and Washington, I think, should welcome this kind of engagement by its allies and partners with Beijing. In particular, all parties should seek to reactivate and strengthen communication channels with China, which is expected to contribute to more regional cooperation rather than fragmented kind of cooperation on the ad hoc basis. And Quad, as already been discussed, is being seen by China as a unilateral kind of alliance to contain China, which I disagree. If you look at many working groups of Quad, such as Working Group on Climate Change, Emerging Technologies, the health security and infrastructure, this is kind of a security partnership rather than security alliance. So in that sense, if possible, I think Quad member states should welcome or open the door to some non-member states to join those working groups of Quad. Lastly, despite limitations, regional cooperation through ASEAN Plus 3 or EAS should not be ignored. Particularly, EAS is the arena where three major giants, U.S., China, and even Russia participate. So we need to kind of revive this kind of a mechanism for constructive purposes. And also, in my personal experience, on the margins of ASEAN Plus 3 and EAS, U.S., ROK, and Japan had a trilateral summit in 2022. So this kind of venue is actually taking place together with the bilateral as well as trilateral. In other words, unilateral gatherings, which means we still have some space, room for creating a synergistic effect. So region-wide multilateral institutions should coexist with bilateral as well as multilateral groupings. Only then we will be able to come up with the concrete plans for freedom, peace, and prosperity in the Asia Pacific through substantive rather than superficial discussions. let me stop there. Thank you.
Professor, I mean, you've laid out very much of a diverse, and it sort of does convey the lattice-like, the web of relationships that is,
Yes.
seem to be forming. If we take a narrow example, on this instance, example for North Korea. I mean, you've mentioned North Korea, but if you could elaborate a little bit on, for a country like South Korea, how does this kind of new architecture help the relationship with North Korea? If it does, or is it a different animal?
I think we have been relying on ROC-U.S. alliance, and also U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral security cooperation, and also CJK, China, Japan, and Korea summit is expected to take place at the end of this month. So this kind of bilateral and trilateral groupings should be expected to create some synergistic effect, despite emerging pessimism, seen through some skeptical kind of reactions from Russia and China, particularly at the UN Security Council. So this is the right time, particularly CJK summit will be kind of a turning point for China to be engaged, and also China will be revisiting its role toward the better and constructive directions.
I think there is a room for that in terms of constructive cooperation on these issues. There's even talk about maybe another six-party talk in the works, which would include all of these players. But again, we're all going off on a different aspect. Let's bring Japan into the discussion. Professor Bayashi, I mean, what is Japan's position in this Asia Security Alliance, and how does Japan look at the future of Asia?
Okay, thank you so much. And first of all, I really deeply thank the Asan Institute to bring this great symposium and the opportunity, even including me. Thank you so much. First of all, changing international security environment really led us to increase our defense budget. Not only in Japan, but also in Europe and other places, not even mentioning Russia, Israel, and those countries. According to SIPRI in Stockholm, they calculated that the world's military spending increased by 6.8% last year. And it was the highest in history. In Europe, it was 16% increase. Also as a result of the Russian invasion and all sorts of conflicts on the world, West countries realized that even we don't have enough military equipment, and we have to produce more, things like that. So the environment forced us to change our attitude and reactions, including budgets, ammunitions, and all sorts of things. And as a result, United States, Japan, and Korea had a historic Camp David summit last year. And during the Golden Week of Japan, Prime Minister Kishida visited France, right in front of Mr. Xi Jinping's visit, and Brazil, one of the leaders of global South, who are trying to be neutral, not being pulled by either democratic group or community against authoritarian groups. As well as the Paraguay, that is the only one South, American country to keep diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So in this way, Japan is trying to be part of the United States while the United States is so busy dealing with Middle East and Ukraine, Russia, and so on. And also, the foreign minister visited 6 countries in Africa. Of course, they are part of Global South and important roles that they are playing. Those visits are followed by the statement that was given by Japanese Prime Minister Kishida in front of U.S. Joint Congress. And he made clear that the United States is not alone. Japan is always with the United States to keep democratic international order, and we will do our best. And it was pretty well received in Washington, I heard. And the United States is also busy with dealing with lots of things. And not only Japan, but also South Korea, Australia, all allies should really get together for the cause of democracy to keep our world safe and peace. And I heard that American Indo-Pacific Command covers half of the surface area of planet and more than 60% of the economy and population of the world. And at the same time, China is speeding up the growth of its military, as we know. In the last 3 years, China has built 400 aircrafts, 20 major warships, and doubled its missile inventory, according to U.S. Navy Admiral Paparo, who just retired from Indo-Pacific Command. And the United States and Japan, therefore, are trying to update their command structure in order to be able to cooperate better and somehow unite our operations. And, well, it is for a smoother teamwork of those 2 countries. As promised during Prime Minister Kishida's state visit to the United States in April, Japan is trying to secure American effort in Indo-Pacific strategies. Therefore, don't really leave. Please don't leave Indo-Pacific area. We need the United States. That was, I think, the main message in front of the Congress and his visit to the United States, Washington. And that effort is part of President Biden's initiative to replace our outmoded hub and spoke system of bilateral alliances with a lattice-like, as everybody mentioned, lattice-like architecture. And this is a huge shift from our relationship in the past toward the future and to deal with the current situation. To handle today's regional challenges, Japan, ROK, the Philippines, Australia, and others need to work more closely. The Quad and AUKUS Defense Pact could be further strengthened for better, I would say, collective deterrence, not collective, security even, or Professor Kim just a moment ago mentioned security partnership. There are lots of different terms in our mind, and we use different vocabularies to describe how we can cooperate and be able to communicate even with China, because it is important to have a good communication. I would say maybe you should use collective deterrence, because it is not to fight against each other. It is just to have a deterrence system to somehow let us communicate with others so that we can somehow talk and negotiate more about better security situation here, and so on. So I would like to propose collective deterrence today. And communication with China is vital to avoid any misunderstanding while strengthening deterrence and clarifying ICAD. This is another word. I think Philippine commander used it. That stands for illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive. ICAD does not work in this region. Having learned that unthinkable was potentially real from the wars in Ukraine and other places like in Gaza these days, we need to accelerate, not just wait and see or study a lot, but we have to accelerate our cooperation. And maybe in July, another trilateral summit could be held during the NATO summit in the United States. I think we should really expect this acceleration of our united concept of deterrence and communication with China and a better relationship in this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll leave the follow-up to the rest of you because I see everybody's frantically scrambling. So I think, your idea of collective deterrence and the acceleration that you talked about is sort of raising a lot of thoughts about where this could lead. So on that point, we'll move back to the U.S. Dean Steinberg, I mean, you talked about, we talked about how Japan is telling the U.S. to not leave Asia Pacific. There's a lot of talk about the U.S. being distracted by Russia and what is going on in the Middle East, but the strategic importance of Asia, of the Far East, the East Asia, is something that is still mainly fundamental to Washington. What do you think?
So, I mean, I always find it kind of curious that people feel that somehow we have to make a choice about these things for two reasons. One, even if we wanted to, the world doesn't let us, right? And I think a lot of people had the opposite view, which was that somehow we should just focus all our attention and energy on the Asia Pacific and the challenge of China and get out of the Middle East and reduce our engagement in Europe. But events don't allow us to do this. But more importantly, I think what we've seen is that these things are connected. And so you can't actually do one. And that we're seeing both for the United States and for our partners this sense of connectedness. I think it's not accidental that after all the Sturm und Drang, that the Congress came together on a security package that had all three regions, right? It had aid to Ukraine, had aid to Israel, and had the military support for Taiwan. And I think it's a recognition in the United States that we don't have the luxury of picking and choosing of these things, and that there's the desire for simplicity isn't going to be achieved. But we're also seeing that both the United States and our partners see the connections, and a number of the panelists have touched on this. We had the German foreign minister was at SAIS last week after coming from an event in Germany where he saw off a German frigate who was on its way for a visit to be in the Asia-Pacific region. We're seeing our partners in this region in their support for Ukraine. And so there is a sense in which, although each of the problems have certainly some distinct qualities, there are a lot of commonalities. It's not accidental that North Korea is helping Russia in Ukraine, or that China in its own way, perhaps not with military support, but certainly with significant economic and technological support, is supporting Russia. And Russia, in turn, is supporting North Korea by blocking the UN extension of the experts group. And so I think there is a recognition in Washington and beyond that we aren't going to have the luxury of picking and choosing one region, and that we're going to do it. But at the same time, there are limits to it. And I think this is really important, going to your point about collective deterrence. I mean, the other lesson that comes from this is that there is support for engagement. Congress did end up supporting Ukraine despite candidate Trump's reluctance about this. But we're not sending troops, and we're not likely to send troops. And if the issue came up for the question of Ukraine membership in NATO, which many of the elites and policy people would like to see, this will remind us of the debates back in the 1950s when Congress had to decide whether we were going to really prepare to go to war for Ukraine or other countries. We're seeing a similar debate as the administration is pursuing a very bold initiative which potentially might involve a security commitment to Saudi Arabia. Whatever you think about the strategic rationale for that, I have serious doubts about whether the U.S. Congress is prepared to make an Article 5 type commitment to defend Saudi Arabia against all comers. And to your point about deterrence, we know from the polling that despite the fact that, again, in Washington, there's tremendous support for Taiwan and a desire to deter aggression by China, there's not broad-based support for the United States to be involved militarily in defending Taiwan. I'm not saying it won't happen, but if you look at the public support. So I think what you see is it's a glass half full, glass half empty story in which the United States, and there's broad-based support in the American public, despite challenges from the left and right, to be engaged, and to be engaged in each of these reasons, as problematic as they are, but also with some limitations. That is to say that there's not a willingness to go and write a blank check and to be sure, in advance that we're going to make these kinds of commitments. And I think that is the challenge. We talk about these different kinds of arrangements. Mike talked about the different ways that they are there, is to recognize that in this world, one, there are limits to what the United States is going to commit to, but also, I think, limits to what our partners are prepared to do as well. And the idea, as several have suggested, that we want to deepen our cooperation with our like-minded partners, but we also recognize that they are a little bit uncomfortable in being in a kind of use it or us against them environment. And I think that that's really the characteristic of the environment that we're in now, that basically recognizes that there are going to be these overlapping arrangements and that we're going to have to tolerate a certain amount of this lack of clarity about the degree in which, in any particular case, the United States might get involved.
I think you're right in terms of the limitations of any kind of agreement that we will enter into the future. It will not have the Article 5 kind of commitment from anyone at this moment. But we are now at the very end of Ambassador Sugiyama. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
But I have given you the mic in some ways to wrap up the first round in terms of laying out the stage of where the Asian security structure is heading and how Japan looks at the changing architecture in this part of the world.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me try to, as concise and as clear as possible in 2 points. Based upon what everybody else seems to be talking about. They seem to agree with each other on a couple of points and something, but before doing that, I have to make one thing clear. I'm being always called ambassador still, but I'm no longer ambassador. I'm a retired ambassador. I'm still holding an office as an advisor to the foreign minister, but I'm no longer paid by the government, so I'm a free man. I'm teaching international at my university. I'm a humble university professor. That said, so today what I'm going to just tell you doesn't necessarily represent the views of the government of Japan, but since I was in the government, I think I know just a bit how they are arguing and how they are trying to make foreign policies. But again, I have to repeat that what I'm going to just tell you is not necessarily based upon the Japanese government policy, my own private policy. That said, everybody seems to be saying these days and agreeing to the point that the security architecture in this region, in East Asia or Indochina, whatever you might want to call it, seem to be in accordance with what US President Joe Biden said at the press conference together with my Prime Minister on the 10th of something of April. It is upgraded. It is really, really upgraded, and it is more strengthened. Lam Emanuel, my friend in Tokyo, U.S. ambassador, did write an article in Washington Post or Wall Street Journal something immediately before summit meeting being taking place in April, did say that this is representing the transformation of the architectural structure from, as everybody was saying, hub and spoke relations to lattice-like relations. Maybe that's correct. we are no longer living in a very flat, one-dimensional or anything, two multi-dimensional, multi-layered architecture, not only bilateral kind of, defense treaty architecture, but also US, Japan, Korea, or AUKUS, or, even involved in India, not in the sense that the common kind of defense policy and something, but in forming some foreign policy issues, and of course Australia seems to become more important, and then this time Philippines, and maybe more. So I don't think I have to repeat what everybody else was saying and everybody is saying these days. My point on this particular one is that this doesn't mean to say that everybody, particularly at least for sure for Japan, has a policy to be confrontational against any country, against such country like China. This latest like a kind of security mechanism, upgrading security kind of cooperation and something, is not aimed at confrontational or containment policy. Neither containment policy nor confrontational policy, nor presumably to appeasing policy. This is a policy of engagement. We try to be engaged in international community as such as Japan, as individual sovereign state, but in collaboration with our single ally of United States of America, like-minded like Korea, which is one of the most important and the closest neighbor, and then Australia, which seems to become more and more important these days, and then Philippines, as I said, and maybe United Kingdom even. But why we are doing this is because we try to materialize our engagement policy. So when it comes to a policy to China, based upon this sort of new upgrading environment, something what we are trying to aim at is to get further engagement from China or from us and from everybody. That's our purpose. Of course, we do say very clearly in the last G7 in Hiroshima or something, or in the last Camp David or whatever, we say that we remain seriously concerned about the situation in the East and South China Sea. We strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force. But at the same time, we are saying publicly that we need China. No one doesn't need China. We stand prepared to build constructive and stable relations with China because everybody needs China. But we need China who is more engaged in international society, rule-based. So sometimes this argument is not that much well said or well understood. I'm being told, immediately after the summit meeting being held in Washington, D.C. last April, I wanted to confirm what I'm saying is in line with my government in saying, because I've never been involved any longer in the government diplomatic policy making. But I was told that what Mr. Sugiyama is saying is not inconsistent with the Japanese government, or more so, the Japanese government seems to be saying that. But I do believe that my government doesn't speak that much well, because some people are saying that, oh, this is something like gang up against China to contain China or something. No, I don't think so. We have no intention to gang up against China or something, because we can't do that. We need China. We need China, but more engaged in the international community. That's the substances. That's the very fundamental point which I would like to make it clear from this podium. My second point is, you see, many people, as I did, talk about political and defense relations, which is quite important. But in a sense, more important thing is business. More important thing is economy. More important thing is trade. More important thing is investment. Now, when it comes to investment and trade and that sort, we or you tend to think about FTA or TPP or CTRP or whatever. We very much would like to discuss the legal framework or something. I happen to be an international lawyer. I'm teaching international law. I love this legality or something. And yet, why we are trying to make that legal framework is for everybody's benefit, for everybody to do better business, to do something better, specific projects, to get money for every one of us. If you do that, I'm not a businessman. I'm just a humble retired diplomat and a humble university teacher. So I don't know not much about business, but I do believe that if everybody can be successful in doing business, getting money to feed people in a mutual way, that would do better for us. So my second point is that not only trying to discuss the legality or treaty framework, which is important. As I said, I love discussing these sort of things as an international lawyer, but try to discuss which are the best projects, which are the best certain way of business doing between Japan, US, Japan, Korea, or trilaterally, or Australia, or United Kingdom, or mainland China, or even Taiwan. I don't think we can do that business with North Koreans these days. But hopefully, in the near future to come, not near future to come, the future to come, we might be able to do that. But my second point, to put an emphasis upon the importance of business. Thank you.
Thank you. Former ambassador.
Yes.
I don't think we're going to get into the subject you love about the legalities, but I think your point about the economic prosperity, mutual prosperity, that may be at the foundation of building a future Asia framework will be one that is discussed in the region and probably in this region at least a very important aspect. I am now going to turn the mic over to all our distinguished guests that I know that I'm just dying to ask our panel questions. So I am going to give you we are about 20 minutes away. So a little time to sort of ask questions on what our panelists have already said, or a general question that you have wanting to ask. This is a setting the stage session, so the specifics will probably go into several of the sessions that are following. But if we have any questions about what you have heard so far, we're taking them. We have hands up. I think someone will bring a mic over, the gentleman here, and then 2 questions that we are seeing so far.
How would you?
Please identify yourself before asking the question. Thank you.
I'm Professor Jia's colleague from Beida. How would you convince people sitting in China, say whatever squad, quad is deterrence or defensive, when under those arrangements you have concrete actions such as literally, that has already happened, denying undersea cable access to China and actively kicking out Chinese companies, either supplying equipment or funding or potentially even accessing those cables. We can't change the geography. We need the Philippines, we need Taiwan, we need Australia, we need other islands to have these cable connections. And then you will say, well, it all depends on China, and all we do is to prepare for uncertainties. We, meaning that's on the so-called like-minded. Is like-minded, you can't just talk like-minded, you have to act and say, you are really doing something to prevent the gathering of adversarial thinking. Everybody, observes the environment and try to be self-protective. A very quick follow-up question is, what are we really talking about? Are we really talking about no more Vietnam? I think that's the professors talk about ASEAN-centered approach. Are we talking about no more Cuba? Or are we talking about no more Ukraine in the sense of, as these arrangements, stockpiling weapons so that in the Taiwan contingency, you will be readier rather than what's going on with supporting Ukraine. So there are serious questions. And I think Professor Jia has been polite of saying, actions and reactions, there is an imagination. And over there in China, regardless of what, this is a land of 1.4 billion people. Yes, you don't like the party, you don't like a particular individual, but time comes and goes. Our people need a life as well.
Yep. Thank you. We'll just add another question before we turn it over to the panelists.
I'm retired Major General of the PLA, People's Liberation Army of China. My name is Yao Yunzhu, and my question is to Professor Nakabayashi from Japan. I appreciate your suggestion that in Asia Pacific, the like-minded states should have a collective deterrence. But when we talk about deterrence, we have to think about what if deterrence fails? Should it become collective defense once deterrence fails? We cannot prove that deterrence has succeeded, but we can see how it can fail, and then what happens. Is it to practice the things that the states which are in the collective deterrence said to accomplish them, or what? That's my question.
Thank you. I think the both questions sort of centered on the limitations of the like-minded cooperations that we've been talking about. There's a specific mention of Professor Nakabayashi, so maybe we started with you.
Thank you so very much for the great question. I actually expected someone would say things like that. And I heard also that collective deterrence is impossible because each nation is so self-centered, selfish, and we cannot really establish the right concept even for that kind of deterrence collectively. But I think at the beginning of this symposium, Dr. Fulna actually mentioned that ideas, individuals, the institution are very important. I thought the idea for us to deepen the understanding or the definition of collective deterrence may serve well. Because even for deterrence itself, it's not that easy to establish or think. And if we think of extended deterrence, we don't know whether it works or not. Depends on how people believe that concept. And collective deterrence might be key to establish our different way of thinking, because deterrence is not defense. Deterrence is not trying to attack others at all. And at the same time, in July 2016, Hague Tribunal determined that China's expansion of maritime force toward East China Sea and South East China Sea would be illegal. But it didn't matter. That kind of legal judgment didn't matter. Then what can we bring China to discuss with us regarding that kind of islands and all sorts of expansionism? And maybe deterrence could be part of a tool to have a better communication and ask them to come into the conversation somehow, into legal or rules-based, low type of conversation we do, we may not be the same thoughts type of nations. But somehow we have to proceed for conversations. And deterrence may be the key if we can establish something peaceful, good teamwork. That is the somehow challenging idea of a collective deterrence. And it is not determined yet at all. So if there are many other ideas from different scholars and practitioners, that would be wonderful to listen and learn from.
Many of our other panelists are also wanting to chip in. Professor Kim, start with you.
Usually, when it comes to region-wide, excuse me, multilateralism is aiming at kind of a three-stage development, starting from confidence building, and then move on to preventive diplomacy, and finally, conflict resolution. The reason why we are talking about deterrence or collective deterrence, as Professor Nakabayashi pointed out, is related with the limitation of existing region-wide mechanisms to deal with a variety of issues as a mechanism for preventive diplomacy. In other words, we have been trying to build our mutual confidence for more than 3 decades, rather than moving toward preventive diplomacy, not even conflict resolution. So due to these kind of existing limitations, United States and allies and partners have tried to create some sort of alternative, not supplanting, but supplementary mechanisms. So, for example, IPEF recently agreed to act collectively toward kind of a collective action against possible economic coercion. So this is not just solely confined to security-related areas, but also economic security and also kind of economic coercion related kind of situations. So things are now moving toward more like a comprehensive deterrence rather than just deal with the military contingencies within the region. So in that sense, we need to address the regional security architecture, not just purely from the military perspective, but also military plus economic. So our deterrence is supposed to deal with strategic uncertainties, but at the same time, possible economic coercion by the third party. So this kind of new ideas are emerging, which are being reflected by the emergence of new unilateral or mini multilateral groupings.
Professor Green?
Thank you, Professor, for the question. Good to see you again. Your question was, how is it possible to convince people in China that these minilateral operations and groupings are not aimed at China? I don't think that's the question that is being asked right now in Washington or Canberra or Tokyo or Delhi or Manila or even Seoul. It might have been the question 8 years ago. It would have been the first question. Now the question that is being urgently asked, I think, is how do we convince Zheng Nanghai, how do we convince Xi Jinping, how do we convince Beijing that it's a very bad idea to fire chaff into the helicopter blades of a Royal Australian Navy helicopter operating on a UN mission, or attack Indian troops with clubs in the Himalayas, or blockade Philippine Navy ships, or there's a very long list that animates this sense that Nakabayashi sense used deterrence. I think we're more at the stage of dissuasion, of demonstrating that these coercive acts, which are seen that way by all the parties in these small groupings, are going to make us cooperate more, and that that's not in China's interests. And I personally think our foreign ministries make a mistake trying to be too polite about this. I think we're not going to have real dialogue and engagement on hard issues between the US and China until we're very candid about what's happening and why we're doing things. And I think our politeness, and Americans aren't usually accused of being polite, but I think politeness is an obstacle to reassurance. And if we can be candid about why these things are happening and what the purpose is, then we can get to what Professor Jha said, and I agree. There are areas, there are hotspots like North Korea, where the US and China have overlapping interests. I worry, Sumi Terry is writing on this, that the current impasse in great power relations is enabling North Korea to move towards nuclear tests, possibly to shape the US presidential election, because they sure want Donald Trump back. This would be bad for China, it'd be very bad for the US, obviously bad for Korea, for Japan, for Europe. These are the areas where, because of I don't think that the other countries are imagining everything, but there is, as Professor Jha said, an immediate presumption of guilt and bad intention. And North Korea is one area where perhaps we should make efforts to look at what we can do together. But I think we have to first get to a level of candor about the dynamics. And that's what's great about the Asan Plenum. We're all former government officials. We can be very candid. And I think the governments need more of that too.
We're going to go with another former ambassador, Sugiyama, and then we'll come back to you, Professor Jha. Yes.
Maybe what I'm going to say is not responding to these two important questions, but related. I should have mentioned that when I was saying not a confrontational, not containment policy, not appeasement policy, but engagement policy, is based upon my notion that in this theater, unlike European theater, I don't think we can create NATO type of security mechanism. I have my own personal opinion about NATO. NATO did exist even though Warsaw Pact was done. Not only exist, but expanded. By saying that I have no intention to defend Putin's invasion. I have no intention. But what I'm trying to say at this particular moment is that, okay, NATO and then these regional collective security system under Chapter 8 of United Nations wouldn't and shouldn't and doesn't apply to this theater. We don't have any intention to try to materialize that. So in this theater, the better way is to multi-layered collaborations and upgrading mechanism and environment or security structure, which must involve in some way or other such big country like China, in some way or other. And then of course we have to deal with the imminent question of North Korea. So that's why I do believe that as early as 2006 October, the late assassinated Prime Minister Shinzo Abe initiated the notion of strategically mutually beneficial relationship between China and Japan. And this does still remain. That was confirmed by the current Prime Minister Kishida when he met with President Xi last November or something in San Francisco. If we try to contain, we try to only be confrontational, this particular policy of strategically mutually beneficial relationship between the two countries wouldn't go along with together. I don't think we do abandon this policy. So this is something that we might think twice in a kind of multi-layered framework or something. That's what I would like to make an additional comment.
You've actually raised a very important question, which we'll ask the final round, but I'm going to give Professor Jha his say in the question that was raised.
Yeah, I think a lot of things are very complicated. It's wrong to jump into quick conclusions. Okay. Like the Indian-China border disputes. China is the last country to want to have this kind of confrontation, especially when China is under huge pressure from the U.S. And when the U.S. is trying to push to push other countries against China, why do we have this kind of border dispute? I think there are very deep historical, cultural, and political reasons to that. Very complicated. But of course, when you think that China is, a country that's spending on expansion, so every piece fits together, but it does not reflect the real picture. Why did the Australian fighter planes went to South China Sea? Okay. What if China sent, warships and fighter planes to somewhere near, in the high sea near South Korea, near Australia? What would Australian do? So it's all quite complicated. Nothing should be taken for granted. So we have to try to face the reality and try to address the problem. That's why I think we need to take a cool-headed approach to all these issues, and then try to sort out our interests and real differences, and then try to manage the difference and promote our shared interests.
Shared candor, I think, is a very important point that a lot of you talked about. But I want to, we have only 5 minutes left, so I think this may be a final round. But I want to sort of ask all of you the point that former ambassador raised, that he said in this theater, the Asian NATO is not possible, and he outlined some reasons. So I'm going to give every one of you the same question. I know I'm going to start with Professor Green, because you wrote a column that said, "Never say never to an Asian NATO." Is an Asian NATO possible? And if so, why? If not, why? Why not?
In the current circumstances and for the foreseeable future, it would not be in the interests of Korea or Japan or Australia or the US to have an Asian NATO if it were like NATO in Europe, because the economic relationship with China is still critically important. I mean, the US trade with China is now 8% of our total trade. It was 15%, but Australia's over 30%, Japan's in the 20%, and Korea in the 20th percentile. That's a lot of economic prosperity dependent on relations with China. And if you move to an Asian NATO, you create a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of confrontation. So I don't think, as Sugiyama Taishi said, it's the intent of any party. The reason I said never say never is because just as all these multilateral groupings seemed like a bad idea 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they're now considered a good idea in order to dissuade and deter China from doing further coercion. So the reason I said never say never to NATO is that ultimately rests on Beijing, ultimately. And I don't think it's the intent to create a NATO, but the collective architecture of security, not the collective security architecture, but the architecture is evolving in response to challenges pretty rapidly. So if, that's why I don't think we can say with 100% certainty never to a NATO. But Sugiyama Taishi's right, it's certainly not the intention or in the current interests of any of the parties we've talked about.
Well, I think NATO is not necessary in this part of the world. NATO has not prevented a war with Russia in recent years, and actually has been a source of tension and confrontation in Europe. So I think we need to have regional security mechanisms to include everyone, to make them stakeholders rather than challengers outside the system. So in this part of the world, we need to have a more comprehensive regional security arrangement instead of bilateral, unilateral things like that, which can be exclusive and divisive. But of course, in history, these things play a positive role as well. But then I think in the long run, we need a comprehensive regional security architecture.
Professor Kim?
I think if Europe had embraced Russia in the very early stage of NATO expansion right after the end of the Cold War, Europe would not have had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Europe has two systems. One is NATO, a multinational alliance, and the other one is multilateral cooperation mechanism, which is OSCE. We have been saying this kind of a coexistence is really an excellent mechanism before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which means this kind of a coexistence was not quite effective. In that sense, I think Asia could be has learned some lessons out of it, and we could upgrade our regional security architecture, into some sort of a multi-layered one, kind of a coexistence of bilateral and unilateral and multilateral ones. If we are able to maintain the principles of inclusiveness and autonomy. So we don't need the Asian NATO because the emergence of minilaterals are expected to play more effective role rather than like Asian version of NATO. So in that sense, I think we need to discover some opportunities to hedge against the future risks in the region through this multi-layered kind of regional security architecture.
Professor Nakabayashi?
Yes. What we are intending is to beg China, don't use ICAD. Illegal, again, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive means of approaching to neighboring countries. In order to do that, we have to, well, expose lots of ideas and discussions among our friends and see how we can bring China to our discussion community and start to think about not using ICAD. And even that term can be debated, and of course, China has different views, but they should also understand our views. In order to do that, maybe our attempt to prepare with collective deterrence may be helpful. Otherwise, it is very difficult to have that kind of conversation with China, not to use ICAD.
Thank you.
So, moderator, if I could take the privilege of my last 2 minutes, I want to talk about undersea cables. In the good old days, we used to think that interdependence was a plus. Created greater prosperity, created greater reliance on each other, was a deterrent to conflict and the like. But what we've seen over the last decade is a focus not on interdependence as a plus, but interdependence as a vulnerability. And the problem with that is that even though we've now kind of changed our language from what is supposed to be a nicer version, de-risking instead of decoupling, if you start thinking about the concept of de-risking, and you take all risks as being risks, there's no end to this process. So we started with the idea of high fence, small yard, and understandably we started with high-end chips and quantum computing and things like this. But over time, the yard gets bigger and bigger. It's not just high-end chips, it's legacy chips, it's batteries, it's EV, it's steel. And we've reached the point in which almost any sense of exposure to each other poses risks, and it does. I mean, these are realistic problems, that they're risks. And so we've reached the question about, are we going to privilege risk so much that we really do completely withdraw from each other? And people say, well, it can't be done. But Mike said, if you look at the reduction in trade between the United States and China, it can be done. And we can get into a world maybe not quite as extreme as the Cold War. So at some point, we're going to have to decide whether this de-risking and protection against risk doesn't itself carry additional risks. And I think that's the pivot point that we're at now, not just for the United States, but for our partners and what kind of world we want to live in.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think our hosts have allowed.
It's a question and comment. At the moment, we Asian, East Asian countries may not think we need Asian NATO, but if China continue to support North Korea's economy, politics, and military build-up, countries like Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, South Korea, and Japan, we may change our mind. We may think, never say never.
Yeah. I think Chairman's comments really tells us how volatile the future can be and the unpredictability of the Asia's future security, which is one of the reasons I think of a sustainable structure in terms of that we allow peace in this region is vital for the future. I think our panelists today have really laid out an array of opinions. I think we have set the stage for the future discussions that will happen today and that will delve into all of these sectors and topics that we discussed here today. I would like to thank our panelists and everyone for listening and participating in this session. Thank you very much.